Good evening. Good evening. Greetings to you, the large audience in this theatre, and to the audience in the Overflow Theatre as well. My name is Graham Aitken, Dean of the Faculty of Education here at the University of Auckland. It's my privilege to introduce tonight's occasion, the second in the series of 3 Sir Douglas Robb lectures to be given by Professors Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. The Faculty of Education is the host faculty for this year's Robb lectures. We nominated Richard and Kate as the Robb lecturers for 2014 because we believe that their work makes a powerful contribution to public debate on an issue that is one of our own central concerns, the effects of inequality upon societies such as ours. A corollary of the critic and conscience role of universities, as enshrined in our Education Act, is that a faculty of education such as ours should be acting as a critic and conscience of education in this society. As a faculty, we accept that responsibility. In both research and teaching, we address the issues of educational disadvantage that call for a critical questioning of New Zealand's image of itself as a nation that stands for equity and fairness for all people. It's now 75 years since Peter Fraser, the Minister of Education in the first Labour government, began his annual report to Parliament in July 1939 in words written for him by the then Director-General of Education, Clarence Beebe, as follows. Apologies for the sexist nature of the statement. This was 1939. The government's objective, broadly expressed, is that every person, whatever his level of academic ability, whether he be rich or poor, whether he live in town or in the country, has a right as a citizen to a free education of the kind for which he is best fitted and to the fullest extent of his powers. Can we say today that the goal of equity formulated by Peter Fraser back then has been achieved? And if not, what is holding New Zealand back from its full realisation? These are questions that concern us in the faculty. One of the compelling answers has been provided by Richard and Kate in their 2009 book, The Spirit Level. Its central thesis is that economic inequality has harmful effects that can be felt throughout society. In this series of lectures, we are able to hear the authors unpacking their argument and presenting the evidence on which it is based. In their first lecture on Monday night, Professor Wilkinson and Pickett discussed the correlations that they identified between economic inequality and the incidence of health and other social problems, including low levels of achievement in school. In tonight's lecture, they will go beyond correlations to identify the causal processes that lead from economic inequality to its further consequences. This will be followed by the third and final lecture in the series on Friday night, in which our speakers will suggest ways in which a more equal society might be realised. So will you now please join me in extending a warm welcome to our 2 Robb lecturers, Professor Richard Wilkinson and Professor Kate Pickett.
Thank you very much, Graham. It's again a wonderful opportunity to be able to give a fuller picture than we normally can of our thinking around inequality. I wish that everyone had been able to, or been forced to go to all 3 lectures, because we are now going to try and explain what we showed on Monday night. As a very brief recap, we showed a whole range of health and social problems. Ones that are more common at the bottom of the social ladder are worse in more unequal societies. We showed this graph We showed that the same index of problems was not related to GNP per capita. We did the same thing for the UNICEF index of child well-being, and then Kate went through all the individual components of these of this index, showing you how the scatter works out for each society in relation to life expectancy or homicides or teenage births or whatever. We find sometimes you have hit an audience over the head with the raw data before they're willing to look under the surface and think inequality really is doing something rather odd. So that was a sort of prelude to getting onto, in a way, what I feel is the more important part of this, what's going on under the surface. The problem we have to explain is this relationship, which is where we finished up on Monday night. I am just going to dismiss the issue of reverse causality. People often ask, surely all these health and social problems could be causing the inequality rather than the causality going the other way from inequality to all these different problems. In a number of cases, we know the causal ordering, and with the studies that have been done on looking at death rates, you can see the changes in inequality come 3 to 12 years before the changes in health. But if you pursue any ideas of reverse causality, you have to think what else could be driving a whole range of health and social problems, making them all worse in the United States, for instance, and better in the Scandinavian countries. Something else has to be explaining why some societies do badly on homicides, on teenage births, on drug problems, on educational issues, on child well-being, on life expectancy, and so on. It has to be something else very deep-seated. And because these are all problems related to social gradients, and it looks as if inequality is affecting those problems in particular, it has to be something else deep-seated and related to social status differentiation. And actually, a number of those health and social problems, it's pretty implausible. In childhood obesity, why should that affect inequality? You know, it's just implausible. Actually, why should higher death rates have a major impact on inequality? So, I think we, principally because we know the causal ordering in a number of these cases, we don't have to take that seriously. But to get into the real meat of this, this evening's lecture, I think it's important to point out that people, when we looked at 168 studies of the relationship between inequality in different societies and measures of population health, including homicide rates, we looked to see how the results of the different studies were affected by whether they were looking at comparing whole nations or states and regions within nations or small area studies, neighborhoods and so on, looking at inequality within a neighborhood and health or whatever within a neighborhood. And you see that the proportion of positive studies suggesting there is this kind of relationship we've been talking about is much higher when you're looking at the larger units. I may say these, the proportions shown there are after people have used all sorts of control variables, many of which we think should not be used as controls because they lie on the causal pathway. But it does look as if, you know, if you're trying to explain why some poor, deprived neighborhood has poor health, it's not the inequality within it that is causing the bad health. It is because it's deprived in relation to the rest of society. And you need to be measuring inequality over the whole society. That led us to think that we were looking at something perhaps much more closely related to the overall structure of class and hierarchy within our societies. And perhaps income inequality, instead of being something quite separate from class and status, was telling us more about the associations that we all are familiar with between social class and many outcomes like poorer educational performance or poorer health in the poorer areas. That maybe the issue is whether we have a very steep social pyramid like that or a much shallower one like that. And the effect that that has on the quality of relationships within societies and so on. If you like, the idea there is that material differences between us create social distances, that the superiority and inferiority and so on are built around, rather as Bourdieu, the sociologist, French sociologist, has shown, that the material differences give rise to all the cultural markers of status and class. I think this actually is quite an important point. If you think, for instance, of Russia, since the fall of communism, and the existence of great poverty on one hand and the oligarchs on the other, I don't think any of us would have any doubt that that is giving rise to the new class system in Russia. And by the time that the children of those oligarchs have been brought up in great mansions and gone to special schools and traveled the world, they will regard themselves as superior beings to other children, and the other children will probably share a lot of that perception. But even if you think in terms of sort of 19th century ideas of class, you know, if you gambled your money away or drank it away, you might be genteel poor for perhaps one generation, but after that you'd just be poor. Or if you made money during your lifetime and moved up, you would be seen initially as nouveau riche, perhaps not quite accepted in the upper echelons of the society, but the second generation probably would be by the time they had developed all the sort of cultural markers of status and class. So we think that what income inequality, what material differences as a whole, including wealth differences, are doing is changing the shape of the class distribution. It's interesting in a way because, you see, when we first, as epidemiologists, started looking at health in relation to, well, health inequalities, why life expectancy is so much lower amongst poorer or less well-educated people in our societies than the rich, we thought that class was just a proxy, a classification of people that showed these differences, a proxy for the real causes, which I think I assumed would be particular material aspects of the material differences between how people lived in different societies. And, you know, our job was to find what aspect of material differences between classes led to more heart disease, what led to more of this cancer or more respiratory disease. But what's happened actually in the epidemiology is we've come to, and this isn't simply Kate and myself, this I think is shared very widely and pioneered perhaps more than anyone else by Michael Marmot, that class and status are much closer to being the causes. And that's been, that recognition, I think, has been helped by animal studies, where you can keep animals in the same compounds, give them the same food, they live in the same material conditions. You can manipulate status experimentally by moving animals between groups. And under those sorts of experimental conditions, you find that you can recreate many of the observed physiological differences that are found, for instance, in the Whitehall study of civil servants. But coming at this as we have through epidemiology, the big change in our understanding of the drivers of population health that's come about through research around the world over the last 20 years is the importance of psychosocial risk factors on health, working through chronic stress, affecting the immune system, the cardiovascular system, very many other physiological processes. Chronic stress making us more vulnerable to a wide range of diseases and looking perhaps more like more rapid aging in a sense. But the main groups, I think, of psychosocial risk factors are these: issues to do with low social status, weak social connections. You know, there are studies of friendship, involvement in community life, the quality of your relationship with your partner, showing social connectedness is extraordinarily protective of health. A year or two ago, a meta-analysis of 150 studies of friendship and health showed that whether or not you have friends is marginally probably more important than whether or not you smoke to survival in a follow-up period. You know, this isn't some vague, wishy-washy factor. It would be nice to think that all being friends was good for us. It's absolutely, it's very well established and really important in all sorts of different kinds of studies and experimental work. For instance, on wound healing or whether you're likely to catch cold when you're exposed to the same measured dose of infectious, given nasal drops, for instance, with cold viruses in. The third factor, stress in early life, that in a sense we've known about for a very long time. But I think the important thing about these is perhaps they are telling us about one underlying source of stress. Maybe they have much more in common than we realized initially. That the insecurities, if you like, that can come from a difficult early childhood are rather like the insecurities that may go with low social status. Feeling of not being valued, anxiety, insecurity, so on. And whether or not you have friends fits into that, because if you have friends, they're people who value you. You get positive feedback from them. You feel relaxed with friends. Whereas if you feel that people don't include you, they don't sit next to you, they don't invite you to things, we all know those self-doubts that come flooding in about, you know, maybe I'm boring, unattractive, socially gauche, you know, that lead people to withdraw from social contact. So I suspect that what the social epidemiology is telling us is that that kind of set of anxieties about not being valued are central to chronic stress at the population level. I mean, of course, there are more important sources, more powerful sources of chronic stress at the individual level. That, you know, losing your home or your job or being sent to prison are appalling calamities. But most of us don't suffer that. And if you're looking at population health, it's these very common sources of stress that are important. Our view of our interpretation of those risk factors was, I think, very much confirmed by this study, Dickerson and Kemeny, a meta-analysis of all sorts of studies where students had been invited into, or volunteers, into a psychological laboratory, given stressful tasks, while having measures the levels of cortisol, central stress hormone measured. So they were interested in seeing how do physiological measures of stress respond to doing stressful things. And in 208 experiments of that kind, included in this meta-analysis, all sorts of different stressors had been used. In writing about an unpleasant experience or doing maths and little maths problems and so on, being videoed while you did things. What Dickerson and Kemeny were interested in is which kinds of stressful tasks most reliably push up your cortisol levels. And they said it was tasks that include social evaluative threat. That means your worries about how you're seen and judged. They say in the paper, threats to self-esteem or social status where others can negatively judge your performance. You know, our worry is about making fools of ourselves in front of other people. That's why public speaking is such a stress. So I think that accords very closely with the interpretation that I'd suggested for those factors. A Swede, Bent Starin, has looked at the effect of feeling shamed. And, you know, those anxieties about making a fool of yourself and so on, it's pretty close to the experience of feeling shamed. And here he's related numbers of ways people have felt shamed. This is from the survey results, how it affects well-being, and long-term illness and depression. It's a remarkably constant gradient across society that looks very like the gradients we see in death rates with any socioeconomic measure. And how this links with health, we do know that even quite low levels of stress have detectable effects on death rates. And it's not just when you get to the high levels of stress that you start seeing effects. It's even the early steps up the scale. Another quite different way in which you see our vulnerability to all these sort of social status issues is in a group of experiments called stereotype threat experiments, where people are asked to do some little task, and you in some way prime them, you give them some little, perhaps hidden reminder of their social status. In this, actually, this is a study that was in a World Bank report a few years ago. It's Indian children from different castes, and they're given a sort of pen and pencil test to do. They do it under two conditions, one where they don't know who is high and low caste, and then another where they do know who is high and low caste. And you see the effect on performance. There, the low caste kids, when caste is known, their performance falls off. These have been done many times. This is, I think, effects on African Americans being given a test, whether they're told it's a test of ability or whether they're told this is not a test of ability. It's much more threatening if you feel it's a test of ability. I've got high and low SES there, but I thought this one was not by social class, but by ethnicity in the States, but there are studies of both that show the same results. Performance is affected by social status, the things that show similar effects of gender. I think one of the really remarkable things in this area is the way social status and friendship keep on cropping up almost as a sort of Jekyll and Hyde pair. I mean, they are both risk factors for our individual health. You know, if I know your friendships and so on, whether you have lots of friends or very few, if I know your social status, I can make some crude prediction about your longevity, maybe. They also crop up together because in more unequal societies where status differences are increased, all the measures of social cohesion and trust and community life weaken. And of course they crop up together in that we tend to choose our friends from amongst our near equals and avoid people who have much higher or lower social status. The reason is that these two things are the sort of two opposite ways in which we human beings can come together. Not only human beings, but I suspect animals as well. That if you think of dominance hierarchies or pecking orders amongst animals, the ordering is based on power, on coercion, on privileged access to resources, regardless of needs of others. And friendship is just the opposite of that. It's based on mutuality, sharing, a recognition of each other's needs. And I think this goes close to the heart of really what we're talking about in the effects of inequality. And Thomas Hobbes, of course, in his political philosophy, thought that because we all have the same needs, we'd be, if it wasn't for a sovereign power to keep the peace between us, we'd be fighting over access to everything, whether it was food or clothing or sexual partners or whatever. And of course animals, there's endless conflict within the species for the same reason, and for the good nesting sites or whatever. And territoriality and so on are some of the ways that is dealt with. But what Thomas Hobbes, I think, failed to see is the importance of friendship, that human beings have the opposite potential, not only to be each other's worst rivals, but to be each other's best source of assistance, cooperation, learning, love, whatever. You know, we can be the best or the worst for each other, depending on our relationships. The gift is the symbol of friendship because it says, I recognize your need. It says in very concrete terms, you know, I recognize your need and your sense of indebtedness. If I give you something that may make you reciprocate the gift, which some psychologists suggest is a human universal, provides a sort of basic social compact between us. And of course, primitive societies, to avoid the conflict of each against all, made huge investment in equality, in food sharing, and so on. And you can still see these patterns. I mean, the word companion, it's about the people with whom you share bread, you share food with. They are your companions. And why we eat together, why in the religious symbolism of communion, the sharing of bread, and so on. Yes, it was Marshall Sahlins, a remarkable anthropologist. He said, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. It's a lovely statement, I think. But he also said of poverty, that poverty is not a certain small amount of goods. It's an invidious distinction between classes, which I think is equally apposite. Rather different, but and to see how widespread these issues are. This is from brain scans. These are monkeys. The two on the left are animals which had been housed separately for 1.5 years. The top one, animals which became dominant when they were housed with others, and the one below, the ones which were subordinate. But you see the dopamine, the area of dopamine receptors seems to be, it lights up on these brain scans amongst the dominant animals when they're housed together. Amongst the subordinates, the ones when they're housed together who remain subordinate, you don't see any lighting up of that kind. But the point of this experiment, in a way that shows the social pain of low social status, is that these monkeys, when they're housed together, are taught how to administer cocaine to themselves. And the low status animals take much more cocaine until their brains light up much more like the dominants. So the bottom right comes to look much more like the top right. I think we have to accept that inequality is having effects that have echoes, very deep-seated echoes in our evolved psychological sensitivity to status. And to ranking systems. The importance of rank for survival, for reproductive opportunities amongst animals is very clear. Interestingly, one of the measures in the Whitehall studies of civil servants that they took early on are measures of fibrinogen, a blood clotting factor that is sensitive to stress. And Here you see levels of fibrinogen amongst men and women arranged by position in the occupational hierarchy in the civil service. So the grade 1 are the most senior civil servants with the lowest levels of fibrinogen, and grade 6 are the most junior office workers with the highest levels of fibrinogen. Of course, low-status monkeys have many more bite marks on them because, you know, they have to keep out of the way of the dominants and be submissive and conciliatory and so on to avoid getting attacked, and they'll lose all the fights and so on. But one thing you do want your blood to do if you are injured is to clot quickly, and that's what high levels of cortisol will do. So I suspect, you know, civil servants are behaving a bit as if they were going to be bitten by their seniors. Maybe in universities too. Another, I think, very interesting indication of these echoes with some quite, well, our evolved psychology, a study in which a photograph of a man was sort of computer enhanced to emphasize the masculine features. I think they made the jaw look a bit squarer and things like that. And women were shown the initial picture and then the enhanced one and said, these people do find most attractive. And in more unequal societies, they prefer the more masculinized one. And of course, in dominance hierarchies, it's about being tough. It's about being, well, I think it's actually about being a good bully. We don't, I think of animal dominance hierarchies. They are hierarchies based principally on physical strength, ability to see off any subordinate animal. We don't have internationally comparable measures of bullying amongst adults. Unfortunately, we learn not to treat each other so obviously badly. But we do have these measures amongst children, where you can compare children in different countries. In our book, we showed one set of data suggesting there's more conflict and bullying amongst kids in more unequal societies. This comes from a different data set with a larger number of countries in it, and you see actually exactly the same correlation that we found. Bullying is more common in more unequal societies. And I think, again, that should make you think about inequality in terms of dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority. In more unequal societies is not that the poor start attacking the rich, it's that we become very sensitive to being put down, humiliation, loss of face. Those are the important triggers to violence, as James Gilligan, he was director of the Center of Study of Violence at Harvard, but also a prison psychiatrist for 25 years, talking daily to really violent men. And this is, I imagine you've had time to read it now. Last point I want to make before Kate takes over is that for a long time I was really worried working on inequality that, you know, all the studies about relative deprivation say that when you ask who people compare themselves with, they compare themselves with people like themselves. And so, you know, I was thinking about people at the top all the way from the top to the bottom, and that seems irrelevant if we're comparing ourselves with people like ourselves. And then I read Robert Sapolsky's. He doesn't look like one of the world's most prestigious neuroanatomists, but that's what he is at Stanford. And he notes in his Primate's memoir, lovely title, that the fights between animals, number 7 in the rank hierarchy doesn't fight 1 and 2, he knows he'd lose. He doesn't fight numbers 20 and 21 because they know they would lose. He fights numbers 6 and 8, because if you're going to change status, it's the people close to you you've got to watch. So it's when you, my equals, start thinking you're better than me, I say, well, who the hell do you think you are? It's that gets our goat, if you like. And that is how inequality really gets into close social relationships. And I think Kate's going to tell you more about that.
Actually, I'm going to put the baboon back up for a minute. I mean, some people worry when we start making inference from or extrapolating from animal experiments like the one with the monkeys giving themselves cocaine, or talking about evolutionary biology and psychology. That photo, I think, helps ram it home how closely related we are to our primate relatives. And of course, you know, we share something like, I think, over 96% of our DNA with our closest bonobo primate relatives. We share quite a lot with bananas as well, though, so we probably shouldn't put too much onto that. But as well as sharing genes, we share behavioral systems with animals that have been studied quite a lot. And all mammals have a behavioral system that's known as the dominance-submission system. And it's very important. It's related to how we get control over the things we want, over the social or material resources we're after. So it's about power. And it's about whether we use dominance as a power strategy or whether we use submission as a power strategy. And so in humans, it's very much related to things like whether or not we feel esteemed or respected. It motivates our behavior. You know, it makes us behave in certain ways. And our experiences as children and as we develop give us a sort of working model of how to balance these things, you know, when it's appropriate to be a bit more dominant, when it's useful to be submissive, and keeping a balance of those things. And if we think about that dominance-submissive system evolving in a human context, we've always, as humans, found some kind of balance, sometimes more one way, sometimes more the other way, between competition and cooperation. Often we feel we need to keep a lid on the dominance, but we don't want too much submission either. And Sherry Johnson and her colleagues at the University of Berkeley have been looking at this dominance behavioral system and reviewing research that links markers of this, so we can find markers of dominance and markers of submission in humans, both self-reported traits, but also biological markers. And they've been looking at how these link to things that we think of as problematic characteristics or even mental illness. And they've shown quite profoundly that dominance behaviors and traits are linked very much to what are called externalizing disorders and narcissism. So this is a more sort of aggressive form of mental health problems, and that subordination and submission are more related to anxiety and depression. Now, we had shown that, I mean, we showed you on Monday that more unequal societies have higher levels of mental illness, and that's been confirmed recently with a study of depression across the different United States. So a statistically significant tendency for people living in more unequal states to suffer more from depression. And indeed, in our own international comparison of mental illness, depression and anxiety were playing a major role in those statistics. As well as depression, schizophrenia is more common in more unequal societies. We didn't know this when we wrote our book. These data were published in 2013. But looking across a number of different countries, higher rates of schizophrenia in more unequal societies. A psychiatrist from the United States emailed me after we wrote about this paper in the New York Times, and he said, "Are you serious?" So I sent him the link to the paper, and he said, but that means I'm going to have to rethink everything I've ever thought about schizophrenia. So I thought, okay. Probably not everything, just some things. So we can go under in situations where we feel threatened, where our status is something that we're anxious about. You know, one strategy is to go under. And people are thinking about depression as an indicator of submission. Paul Gilbert, psychiatrist in England, has written extensively about how the symptoms of depression mimic the symptoms of submission. But we can also take an opposite strategy. Instead of sort of going under when things are tough, when social relations get strained, and when status becomes very important, we can try and do the opposite. We can try and sort of claw our way up. We can try and big ourselves up. We can try and make sure we stay on top. Now, there's a phenomenon that kind of gets joked about, that lots of people think they're better than average. If any of you ever listened to Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon days on American public radio, Lake Wobegon is the town where all of the children are above average. 96% of Americans think they are better drivers than average. A statistical possibility. At dinner last night, I overheard, I think, somebody saying that it's over 80% in New Zealand. It's 60-something% in Sweden. That's still quite a lot of people thinking that they're better than average, but very, very clear differences between societies. And we had wondered for quite a while whether or not people living in more unequal societies would have more of a tendency to do this kind of thing, because status is more important. So it's more important to big yourself up. And indeed, that's exactly what's been shown in a paper published in 2011. In this graph, what's being correlated with inequality is what psychologists call self-enhancement. And it's exactly this phenomenon of thinking, you know, you're better than other people, you're better than average. Better looking, cleverer, better driver, nicer, whatever it is. You're much more likely to do that kind of thing in a more unequal society. And another example comes from work where people have been looking at narcissism. And the most eminent researcher in this area is a woman called Jean Twenge, who is in California. And she had been interested for a long time in issues of self-esteem in young people, and had noticed that over time in the United States, self-esteem, measures of self-esteem were going up and up and up. But at the same time, measures of anxiety among young people were going up and up and up. And those two things didn't seem to fit together. And eventually, she and others have come to the realization that our old sort of bog standard measures of self-esteem don't really measure what we think they're measuring. True self-esteem is a realistic assessment of your own capabilities and feeling okay about those. But there's another kind of feeling okay about yourself that isn't based on a realistic assessment of your capabilities, and that's narcissism. And our old measures of self-esteem were picking up both kinds of feeling good about yourself, both a healthy self-esteem and an unhealthy sense of narcissism. And a narcissistic personality inventory has been developed to measure levels of narcissism in different populations. So we can now distinguish between sort of measures of healthy self-esteem and measures of narcissism. So if any of you fancy finding out whether or not you're a narcissist, you can go online and Google narcissistic personality inventory and you can take the test. Okay? It's very simple. It consists of 20 paired statements and you just pick, one of each. They're not all easy to choose between. One of them says, I really hate to look in the mirror, and the opposite statement is, I love looking in the mirror. Okay? And it's not that simple, is it? Because, on a bad hair day, you don't like looking in the mirror, but if you're all dressed up to go out and feeling pretty good, yeah, you don't mind looking in the mirror. I didn't find that one too bad. The one I found hardest was the one that said, do you think the world would be a better place if you were in charge? I thought, yeah. I do, really. There's one or two things I'd do. You know, just a couple of simple things and the world would be a better place. And I said to Richard, I'm a narcissist. I think the world would be a better place if I was in charge. He said, you've got no idea of the unintended consequences of what you would do. So you see, he is a much nicer person than I am. But actually, the statement that went along with that was, I would be terrified, you know, to be in charge of the world, and I do think that is rather true. Anyway, Jean Twenge has been studying narcissism and its rise over time, and we've plotted it here against income inequality, rising over the same period, and these are data from the United States. And in fact, those old measures of self-esteem have become really pretty useless in the United States, because all the students, if you use it in a student population, they all max out. They all score at the maximum. Another piece of really interesting research, which we feel, you know, very glad to have seen because it helps fill in the jigsaw puzzle, is a study looking at status anxiety in different countries. So, you know, when we were writing the Spirit Level, this is what we are theorizing is going on, that income inequality increases status anxiety in different populations, but we didn't have any data at all to be able to look at that. And now there are data. I've seen at least 2 studies. Here's one where levels of status anxiety are being compared between countries with low levels of inequality, that's the bottom line, medium levels of inequality in the middle, and then low levels of inequality at the top. And they're being arranged by levels of income across society. This is for European countries. And you can see that there are higher levels of status anxiety among those with lower incomes, but at all levels of income, there are higher levels of status anxiety in the most unequal countries. So lots of new research that is helping to fill in this picture of the psychosocial pathway between income inequality and all of the health and social problems that we showed you on Monday. Status anxiety, I've just shown you. Self-enhancement, I've talked about. There are other studies showing that people are more agreeable in more equal countries. Agreeableness is one of what's called the Big 5 personality traits, and it's to do with being empathetic and pro-social. Happiness has been linked to levels of income inequality, and so has solidarity, a sense that people are willing to help each other out. I've shown you narcissism and depression and schizophrenia, and I will just mention before I move on that there are now studies from sociologists showing that in more equal societies, more people take part in civic activities. They're more likely to vote, they're more likely to read newspapers, to be politically active, to join associations. They're also more likely to take part in cultural activities. It's as if in a more equal society, more of us feel that society's there for us, we can get engaged, we can participate, and we're welcome. But I'm now going to move on to a set of studies that tell us a little bit about how people behave by social class, that compare the behavior of people of high social status to those of low social status. And I don't know what it's like here in New Zealand, but in England we've been developing a pretty nasty discourse in the media about people of low social status. They are often described as lazy, as shirkers, as drug addicts. A lot of negative stereotypes. But here are some experiments and some observations from Paul Piff, a psychologist at Berkeley, looking at high and low social status people. One of the things he did was an observational study. I suspect he sent his doctoral students out to do this. They observed cars at intersections, and they had to note down whether or not the car cut off another car or not. And they also watched cars at a pedestrian crossing to see whether they stopped to let old ladies across the road, etc. And for each car they marked down its year and its make. And then the cars were classified by how much they would have cost to purchase. So they're given a status ranking. And if you drive cars of a high value, you are more likely to cut off other people at an intersection or refuse to let pedestrians cross the road. So quite the opposite of what you might have expected. He did a number of sort of lab-based experiments too, bringing people into the laboratory of high and low status, putting them in situations where he could observe their behaviour. There was one where there was an actor involved in the room pretending to be another participant in the experiment and to be in distress. People with low social status were much more likely to offer to help and to try to do what they could for that person. There were experiments where people were allowed to cheat. People of high social status were much more likely to cheat, and indeed were much more likely to openly admit that they would cheat on an exam, say, or commit fraud if given the opportunity. When given time, when they thought they were being unobserved and had told they might be photographed soon, people of high status were more likely to spend lots of time staring in the mirror. But worst of all, they were more likely to steal candy from children. Given an opportunity to take sweets from a jar, which they had been told were sweets for the children in an experiment down the hallway, people of high social status took more candy. That all might feel a bit depressing, because these are the people with power. But there is one hopeful message from Piff's research, and that we see when he did experiments where he also included what he called a priming condition. And the priming condition, he was calling it an egalitarian prime. He tried to get people to think about egalitarian values before they took part in the experiment. I think all they had to do was to write down a few sentences about why all people should be treated equally. And when he did that, the difference between them on various measures disappeared. So in the top line, we're seeing the difference between low social class people on the left and high social class on the right on a score of narcissism. There's quite a difference. But after they've been given an egalitarian prime and asked to think about the value of human beings, then the difference between them is diminished. So part of the value of us all talking about inequality, thinking about inequality, educating people about inequality, is that we may start to change the way that people think. I'm going to finish by just discussing the importance of early childhood. Richard referred to it, you know, in the context of psychosocial causes of health and ill health earlier. We believe that inequality is sort of passed on to children in two stages. First, parents themselves experience living in a more or less equal society and suffer or do not all of the consequences that come with that. And that shapes their parenting style. It shapes the way they prepare their children for the adult world. In a sense, they're passing on their own experience to prepare their children for the kind of world they're going to find themselves in. And this may involve what are called epigenetic switches. Epigenetics is a fairly new science, examining how the environment causes our genes to switch on and off. When Richard was at a conference, I can't remember where, Switzerland, Steve Suomi, who's a primatologist and geneticist from the US, came up to him after he'd given his talk on inequality and said, "I can explain that. I think it's epigenetics." And he has done experiments with monkeys showing that if they are reared by their mothers versus being reared in groups of just other young monkeys or with non-related adults, they have thousands of epigenetic changes in all systems of their bodies. So we're learning more and more about how stress in the prenatal period and in the early childhood period actually affects gene expression. And indeed, we saw a study recently showing that telomeres are shortened. Telomere shortening happens as we get older. It's a sign of aging. But we saw a recent study where children from difficult social backgrounds had telomere shortening, far more than children who'd come from more stable backgrounds. So we can think of childhood, that vulnerability of early childhood, that plasticity of children, as being there. That period of sensitivity allows them to be prepped for their adult environment. And in a sense, if you live in a more unequal world, like the baby on the left who's wondering how he should be or she should be, if it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, you need to fight for all you can get. You need to learn not to trust others. This will be passed on to you through your parents' experiences of the world they live in. If you live in a more cooperative, more equal society, where you can depend on reciprocity and cooperation, where empathy is useful and you can trust others, then you'll grow up learning to take that strategy. You probably won't be aware of this case. It received a lot of attention in the UK a few years ago. A woman and her own mother and two sisters all received sentences for goading the woman's toddler children to fight each other. A video of them fighting was found by their father. He had been away in the army at the time the incident happened. He found it when he got home. And the video shows the women laughing as they, encourage the children to hit each other. But the women were unrepentant when interviewed by police and indeed in court. They felt they were toughening their children up, the tough world that it is out there. They needed to be prepared for that rough environment. So I suppose in summary, what we've been hoping to show you today is that greater inequality leads to stronger feelings, more extreme feelings of superiority and inferiority. It increases the social distance between us so that status competition becomes more important. We feel more status insecurity, more worry about how we're seen and judged. We experience more of those social evaluation anxieties and threats, which are most likely to cause us chronic stress and to make us ill, to behave in problematic ways, and for the social fabric of the whole society to start to be torn apart. So we think there used to be a fairly naive view about inequality, probably still held by a lot of politicians today, that it only matters if it creates poverty, or if income differences are seen as so unfair that something has to be done about them. But a more accurate view is that inequality brings out features of our evolved psychology to do with dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority, how we treat each other, that it increases status competition and insecurity. So it affects us profoundly. It affects us all the time, and it affects us at every level of society. I hope we've convinced you of that, and that you'll come back on Friday to hear us talk about what might be done about those things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate and Richard. There's time for some brief questions, so if people have questions, there's a microphone nearby. Please keep them as questions if you can. One over the left, one at the top.
We live in an international world where competition and the economic model encourages competition. Have you done any work on the effect of a competitive economic model in leading to things that you've talked about, depression and so on?
Did you? The effect of competitive economic model.
I left my hearing aids at home, so Kate will have to relay this to me.
Any effect?
I suspect that the prevailing ideology almost creates the people it thinks exists. I mean, if you put people in sort of stick and carrot situations, you increase extrinsic motivation, you decrease the social motivation. I think it has profound effects. I'm afraid our institutions create the people that they cater for. Is that an answer to... And is that the point you were raising?
I think what I'd add to that is that there have been studies of narcissistic and psychopathic traits among those who lead in the business world compared to those who are subordinate in the business world. And quite astonishing levels of psychopathy showing up in business leaders, on a par with what was being found in secure prisons. And well, it's not really funny, is it? Because actually, if we think about who do we want showing leadership to us, who do we want managing us, you know, it probably isn't people with those traits. There's quite a good book called Snakes in Suits by David Hare and a co-author, which looks at this phenomenon.
I always forget the title and think it's Snakes in Trousers, but it's Snakes in Suits.
I was not going to make that joke.
I guess what I'm saying is a little bit more a comment than a question. And I actually found your talk quite interesting because it reflected a lot of sort of my own personal experience, and I think that I didn't come from a family that had income inequality as such, but definitely had like status anxiety associated with minority status. And probably most of my primary school to high school years, I had quite severe depression. And it only started changing when I came to university. It was a good few years through my university career and started to meet people that sort of were talking about this conversation. And that was in political parties and student activism and classes and all of that kind of stuff. So because those people that I was interacting with sort of understood all of this conversation, that meant that it was the first time in my life that I was on an equal kind of platform. And that had a direct impact on my mental health and actually success in all the other facets of my life. So it's really interesting to see how that is reflected in the research as well.
I'm glad you managed to find that connection. I mean, we've together done a lot of talks over the past 5 years, and generally what we find when we're explaining these causal processes to audiences, you just see a lot of people nodding, because this is something we all experience. You know, it's our lived experience every day. So it's, you know, income inequality isn't a strange thing going on somewhere else to other people, you know, only the business of economists and politicians. It's something that affects, you know, all of us each and every day.
I think many of our the most unequal modern societies, what we call the social evaluative threat is as intense as it perhaps has ever been in human societies. And of course, those feelings of insecurity, self-doubt, lead us to withdraw from social life. I think that's an important contributor to the weakening of community life and social cohesion that we see. But what's so sad is we always see it as a private weakness and vulnerability. And of course, part of overcoming it might be to see that we all have these fears.
Hi Richard, hi Kate. I was just wondering if you could give us a taste of Friday. We're coming out to an election. Could you please give us one example of something the current government could do, or the government which takes over from them, hopefully? Can you give me one example? Can you give me one example of something they could do?
Soundbite to prepare for Friday.
Can you give me one example of something they could do to address the issue of inequality in New Zealand? Thank you.
Democratise the economy.
Oh, that's good, because it's a bit of a tease.
I think that's a fine way to finish and a nice lead into Friday. From the snake in the suit at the front there, I feel I should take my jacket off. My thanks to you both for building a wonderful argument for us. Thank you very much.